In tonight's episode, I've compiled some of the most mysterious, disturbing, and terrifying cases of things in the national parks, from missing persons to paranormal phenomena and eyewitness accounts. Enjoy. Our first encounter story is by a man by the name of Teddy, a volunteer park ranger, outdoor survivalist, and avid recreational hiker. This was not a sighting of some wild beast that's a conjured work of art of the imagination. What they saw this day was in fact real, or so they claim. Now, Teddy was patrolling the National Forest area, which here borders on the Chickasaw area. Now, at the time it was late fall in the Chickasaw National Reserve. Teddy was on patrol in the early evening time, and they had just come out of a small forested section and was about to go up a small hill. The area is heavily wooded with hickory, oak, cedar, elm trees, thick underbrush, and lots of low-lying areas, which sometimes will hold water for spring runoffs or rainstorms. As Teddy began driving, something had caught his eye at the top, where the woods meet a clearing that goes back into an old field that is now overgrown. It looked to be like a large man standing there, but as soon as he'd got close enough for him to see it in full view, this figure sprinted off in the woods towards one side and ultimately disappeared into the brush. Now, he claims this thing never made any sound while running, and he can't overestimate just how big this person was. He claimed that it stood at least 7 to 8 feet tall, wide, broad shoulders, and he could get a pretty good look at the outline, the arms, etc. He never looked or turned in his direction, but he had to try and stop his vehicle and kind of double take and register what he was looking at. He estimated that its weight would be well over 400 pounds, comparing it to that of another person or an animal. The distance was roughly 80 or so yards, and is not an overestimate either, considering the clarity of the sighting that he had had. Now, the whole year, this particular spot was always kind of spooky to walk back into, just because of how thick and overgrown and dark it was in there. And it kind of separated it from the sun-bleached meadow portion of the forest and made it impossible to really go far back at all. Now, immediately after the sighting, Teddy tried rationalizing and writing it off as just a huge man. However, the circumstances surrounding this sighting just didn't make a lot of sense to him. Now, I'm not one to quickly point fingers and say it was something supernatural or even a Bigfoot. The fact that this person was in such thick brush and apparently wearing all black while being able to move extremely quickly through the brush just does not sit right with me or Teddy. Teddy has been back there himself many times, and the brush is extremely thick. In fact, it's so thick that you can't just easily up and run through it. He had the chance to go back there himself several times to look for any signs of anything suspicious. Now, it's hard to tell if any tracks could be back there, but he claimed that it did look like something of substantial size was actually bedding down further back. However, that could easily be attributed to the deers or other wild animal in the area. So there is nothing truly conclusive, at least none that he could find. When Teddy had the chance to speak to a close friend who is retired, he's had several run-ins with what he believes to be Bigfoot in the same National Reserve. Since he is full Chickasaw, he and his people have many stories of what they thought to be Bigfoot all around the same area. Part of this reserve is supposedly Bigfoot territory, or so Teddy is told, and that's why there is a higher percentage of sightings being reported all around. And that could correlate with what he had in his own run-in. Now, his friend, who he spoke of, told Teddy that even the elders back then would talk about what they called as a black fox kind of creature, which is separate from the creature that Teddy described. The beast, they explained, was taller than a man and was kind of a guardian of the forest, so to speak. It had a head that was similar to a fox with more canine origins. This creature could be malevolent at times and potentially even dangerous. The Chickasaw people, he's told, have an actual word for this creature, but he was never told. He's not trying to stray away from the sighting, but he thinks that the anecdote is fascinating to say the least, and coincides with many of the other supposed sightings in the same area. Taking into account everything, does this make Teddy a believer? He's not sure, but it definitely opens up the realm of possibilities. So the question goes, what exactly did Teddy see? And what is this black fox creature that the Chickasaw people speak of? Could they potentially be talking about a Dogman or perhaps a creature of mythology? I'll let you be the judge. Michigan park rangers can't explain the mysteries, the strange disappearances, and the almost supernatural phenomena surrounding the Lake Michigan Triangle. As a matter of fact, in February of 1978, a man by the name of Stephen Kubaki happened to go missing mysteriously under strange and bizarre circumstances. However, his recovery was even more bizarre than you could ever imagine. Stephen, who at the time was around 23 years of age and was busy attending a small Christian university known as Hope College on the southeastern section of Lake Michigan. He was a pretty normal guy by societal standards, very free-spirited, very intelligent, and like many who have gone missing in the past, an avid backpacker, hiker, he had climbed mountains. This guy was an all-around outdoorsman fanatic, which is why on this rendezvous of being out in the wild, he was cross-country skiing in Lake Michigan. His original intention was only to be gone for maybe a day, if not more than that. But obviously, once he failed to return, friends and family immediately knew that something had happened. It was actually when Saugatuck snowmobilers had happened across his abandoned cross-country skis and a backpack thought to belong to Kubaki that then the authorities had been alerted. After recently receiving information of his disappearance, it did not take long for them to put two and two together, therefore assuming that these obviously belonged to Kubaki. When they had gone to investigate, they had found over 200 yards of feet prints leading past the edge of Lake Michigan. Therefore, it was concluded, or at least theorized, that he had somehow walked over into the water and had fallen through a patch of ice, therefore falling into the icy waters below and dying. However, even though that was the widely accepted theory of what happened to Kubaki, that was not the end of his search. After several long days of relentless searching from land and air personnel, they were unable to turn up anything that would prove that Kubaki was still alive and well. It's as if he had just disappeared and vanished into the thin air. After a multitude of attempts to find any trace of Stephen, all hope was lost after some time, and it was eventually just noted that he had disappeared and he was gone. Now, here's where the story has a twist. Fast forward all the way to May 5th, 1979. And our hero, Stephen Kubaki, is waking up in a grassy knoll just outside of Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The sun is shining, there's grass and flowers all around him. It is in the heart of spring, and here he is waking up, fully conscious of himself and where he's at, and he realizes, not only where am I, but he's wearing an entirely different outfit than he last remembers. He has a brand new pair of sunglasses, he has a brand new pair of sneakers, and he has a backpack full of strange hiking and hitchhiking equipment that is not his, that he had somehow acquired. In fact, he even had a shirt from a Wisconsin marathon he supposedly ran, and equipment that would lead him to believe that he had traveled to Chicago, Utah, San Francisco. Completely startled by all of this, he found a way to hitchhike to the nearest town, which was Pittsfield, where he was able to obtain a newspaper that would show the actual date, and the date read May 5th, 1979. He was startled by this and could not comprehend where the last 14 and a half months had gone of his life, nor could he account for it. What's strange is that Stephen could remember vividly up to the very point that he had lost consciousness, and then somehow remembers waking up in this grassy knoll. Pittsfield, Massachusetts is 700 plus miles away from his original missing location, and as soon as he could, he fortunately had relatives, his aunt, living in Great Barrington, which is roughly 20 miles away from his current location now in Pittsfield. So he somehow managed to find a ride from Pittsfield to his aunt's house, where he was then reunited with his long-lost family. Or long lost to him, of course. Of course, after he had been found, or found himself, I guess you would call it, he was asked by news reporters and family, what happened, where did you go, how have you just been gone for 14 and a half months without any trace? And he had zero explanation. In fact, the only thing he could remember was that he was trudging through the snow, fearing the darkness and cold setting in, so he took time to sit and rest. And the last thing he could really remember or make out as an explanation was that the cold must have overcome him, or sheer exhaustion. And after he lost consciousness, he knows no more. Now, how this man mysteriously traveled over 700 miles east and had acquired an entire new wardrobe, sneakers, sunglasses, and new gear and equipment is beyond anyone's guess. In fact, Kubaki was so puzzled by this, he even told reporters that he was determined to backtrack and find out as best he could what exactly happened and why. A very interesting theory about this case is that he was somehow affected by the Lake Michigan Triangle. Now, if you haven't heard of the Lake Michigan Triangle, it's very similar to the Bermuda Triangle, where it has a history of all sorts of strange sightings and phenomena, from ships disappearing to people vanishing, people seeing apparitions, and all sorts of strange stuff going on. Sam B Dubal disappeared on October 9th, 2020 in Mount Rainier National Park in Washington State. At only 33 years old, he was very fit and very adamant about doing this solo hike that he had been so excited to do. And as solo hikes are, it's pretty much expected to be returning the following day because you shouldn't be gone for days on end, at least not with this trail loop. Sam was even spotted that day on the Mother Mountain Trail Loop, so he was in good spirits and alive and healthy. But then day turned to night and day turned to night again, and before you know it, no one's heard from Sam at all. And finally, on October 12th of 2020, Sam was officially reported as missing. Mount Rainier is considered one of the most dangerous places to solo hike. And this is due in part for several reasons. Number one is because it has a very high chance of volcanic eruptions, but also the high amount of hiking deaths that have been reported. And you couple that in with misadventures and icy slopes that people fall down and die, foul play, and all the other reasons that people go missing or die. It just makes for a dangerous national park to solo explore by yourself in terms of numbers. But our Samuel was aware of this and had prepped accordingly. He had a cell phone, he had plenty of equipment with him, he had an overnight tent. I mean, this man was not a newbie, he was an experienced solo hiker. In fact, this was not his first solo hiking experience either. So to many, this was very strange and surprising that Sam would just turn up missing. Mount Rainier at a staggering 14,000 plus foot summit, also known by others as Tacoma, is an extremely large and active stratovolcano in the Cascade Range of the Pacific Northwest. Mount Rainier is actually located within Mount Rainier National Park. Who would have thunk that? About roughly 60 miles southeast of Seattle. It is the highest mountain in the state of Washington and the Cascade Range alone. Sam Dubal was not an avid hiker, but also an extremely intelligent college graduate. Having earned his degree, his PhD, mind you, in medical anthropology from UC Berkeley in 2018, he was a man of logic, reason, and intelligence. And in doing so, had even begun to teach at Washington State's Anthropology University Department starting in June of 2020. Everyone he had worked with, from colleagues to students to friends, all claimed he was a very, very intellectual man, quick-witted, smart, and loved the outdoors. The Mount Rainier park rangers, who operated in search and rescue for Sam, searched and searched for 9 days without finding any evidence of Sam ever existing on the mountain. There were not only hikers and volunteers searching by foot, but they had helicopters scanning the entire perimeter of the trail he was last seen on, going over subalpine meadows, dense pine forests, rocky terrain, and even around bodies of water, all in search for Sam. At this point, Sam was assumed to be dead. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter the search, winter storms had begun raging through the areas, dropping the temperatures dramatically in the area. And unfortunately, with all these search efforts involved, Sam is still noted as having not been found. In fact, one of the more notorious events surrounding the Lake Michigan Triangle is in 1891, a schooner that was named the Thomas Hume had set off across the lake to the other side in search of lumber. And somehow, in the midst of traveling from one shore to the other, the ship had disappeared, along with its crew of 7 sailors. And what's strange is today, with all of our technology and the fact that we can trace things on the bottom of the lake and find wrecked ships, there is zero trace of the ship ever existing, and they cannot find any wreckage of it on the bottom of the lake. But it doesn't end just there, because in 1921, 11 people inside the Rosabelle ship had also somehow mysteriously vanished without a trace while in the Lake Michigan Triangle. However, the ship was later found overturned in the water. When they were able to pull the boat ashore and observe it for details or clues to what had happened, the ship appeared to have been in a collision with another ship. However, at the time, there was no other ships that had reported an accident or a collision at all, making many scratch their heads and wondering how and why is this possible. But perhaps one of the more disturbing and strange cases of the Lake Michigan Triangle is that of George R. Donner, because on April 28, 1937, Captain Donner had just mysteriously vanished from his ship cabin. The sail was going smooth and everything was normal. The captain alerted his entire crew that he was going to retreat to his quarters to rest. And after doing so, about 3 or so hours later, one of his crew members went into his cabin to report to him, "Hey Captain, we're nearing the port," and he was nowhere to be found. It would have been impossible for him to sneak off the boat since there were crew everywhere, and someone surely would have seen him if he had jumped off the boat committing suicide somehow. So where did he go? And more importantly, if he did disappear, why did none of the other crew disappear as well? Of course, at the time they searched as thoroughly as they could, but to this day, his disappearance remains unsolved. The following story, submitted by the name Sydney. They have a story that will blow all of us away. Now, they haven't shared this with many people, and due to the sensitive nature of the details in the story, it's not something they're exactly comfortable sharing. However, due to my platform, apparently they feel safe enough to share it anonymously. Now, for some quick background information, Sydney's 35 and has worked in the parks and recreation for almost 7 years. This story's events occurred back in 2013 in the same area as the last story with Teddy, the Chickasaw National Reserve in Oklahoma State. Here's the story. So, Sydney was working for the Bureau of Land Management, in charge of monitoring and enforcing safety regulations on employees working on federal government land. They specifically were in charge of one site in an area of old-growth forest, roughly about an hour away from their cabin. Now, their family had moved out to work these sites for 3 months at a time, and they had already been there for the past 2, keeping the sites safe and steadily driving between each to ensure everything was going as planned. Now, their tasks were simple. Mostly road maintenance and repairs to existing buildings and structures. Pretty mundane, boring stuff, really. Nobody was really looking forward to their 3rd and final month there, but with the paychecks they got, who in their right mind would be? One day, Sydney was informed by her higher-ups that there was some tasks to be changed. They had one road within the sites in particular that was known to have frequent incidences of feral hogs causing damage. They were essentially everywhere in the area due to an overabundant amount of food. So, they had asked Sydney to go in and kind of help take care of the area a bit. Of course, all this extra work kind of fell into Sydney's and coworkers' lap, so it was just the cherry on top of all their normal work. Great, right? Well, she slowly began to put the pieces together, but being out in the middle of a national park, she had brushed any distressing thoughts aside and worked as usual. Well, the feral hogs were abundant along the said road for sure. Each morning, she would drive down an en route to the final sites and check at the first site to make sure all was good. Not so much. There was this overwhelming dread and something so uncomfortably off about the place. Everything was fine throughout most nights, though, in the camp. But then in the early morning hours, Sydney began to notice a huge influx of dead, torn-apart hogs off the path. Even the coyotes on one side of the campsite began howling like crazy, as if in complete distress. It was not a kill howl. Things like this kept happening day after day. The dogs would constantly act up at night and refuse to stay outside. Weird things were going on, but Sydney was trying not to piece everything together. Now, fast forward a couple more days, and just so everybody is aware, this was the 3rd and final month of work there. They're getting continuously antsy, ready to be done with their time in the forest. Their tasks were around the same routine every day, day after day. Now, the dead feral hog situation continued to build up, and it looked vicious. Evidently, this had now become a feeding ground for what Sydney assumed at the time was coyote food. However, she never considered the nervous howling and yipping that would occur at night. She should state here that she's heard how coyotes sound when they make a kill and the noises they make. She's also heard how coyotes are when they are in complete distress, and this is exactly what it sounded like. The thoughts of some alpha predator being in the woods at the time never really occurred to her, and if they did, they would have assumed it likely be a black bear. Nothing would have prepared her for what was to come. On one of the final days back at the cabin, after it had already grown dark, her and a coworker were sitting on the porch just chewing fat with each other, looking out towards the old growth trees, and thought that she saw a bright green mad glow shimmer and quickly disappear. She interrupted the conversation with her coworker and pointing into the old growth, asking him if he had saw that. He replied no, he had not, and seemed very annoyed that Sydney had interrupted him. Surely but slowly, they got back into conversation when she again saw a small flickering of lights. They were multicolored lights, kind of like LEDs, but they were different. And this time, the coworker saw it as well. They both thought about going out there to investigate, but they wanted to watch further, figuring somebody was simply out there in the old growth. There were also no campsites around this exact location, at least not for several more miles. The odds of somebody being out here are slim, and the question is, why? They both instantly heard this loud banging sound that reminded Sydney and coworker of sheet metal being shot at with bullets. It was very loud and made both of them very uncomfortable. And within seconds right after, they began hearing movement all through the old growth, the same direction they were looking. And what her coworker and her initially thought were just people messing around back there would soon prove to be something else entirely. As the seconds dragged on, the sound of movement would become much clearer, and they could make out that it was actually two distinct figures moving in the brush. Whatever they were, they sounded very heavy and large, and this is due to the amount of foliage being stomped on and large branches being snapped. Whoever or whatever was out there was not at all concerned about staying stealthy or trying to conceal their location. At this point, red flags are just firing off in her gut, and for the worst part, she has no idea what's about to happen. As soon as it began, everything just seemed to die and stop suddenly. Whatever these two figures were seemed to stop right at the tree line of the old growth. Because it was dark out and they had minimal light, they could barely make out anything past the old growth, which was in perfect view of the porch they were on. Now, her coworker began panicking and went to turn the porch light off because it felt like one of those situations they were in where they were completely illuminated and exposed. In hindsight, she's not exactly sure what her coworker sought to achieve by turning off the porch light, but it's what happened. Now, the second the light went off and darkness enshrouded everything, she described it something like a horse or something deeper, making these grunting, groaning noises, as they could hear one of the figures was moving off around to the left side, going deeper off into the brush. The other one was staying put, and as her and her coworker looked closer, they can now see what clearly resembled eye shine. Do you know what it's like when you shine headlights into the eyes of a deer? They almost illuminate this kind of golden glow. And that's close to what Sydney and coworker saw, except the eyes were a gleaming crimson red. Sydney can't exactly speak for her coworker who was there with her, but she will say in that moment, she's never felt primal fear like that at all in her life. And within seconds, but feeling like hours, letting out noises to let her know that it was somehow completely dissatisfied with the situation. And at that point, began slowly backing away into the darkness where it could be no longer seen. She doesn't understand how any eye shine could be possible. The eye shine was not originally even seen until the porch light was off. So she's unsure if it did not get close enough to the tree line until they turned it off, or maybe it just wasn't visible with the light on. After it backed off, they both ran into the cabin completely terrified and waited. The night itself remained silent and stayed that way the rest of the evening. She wished she could say that the rest of that night was eventful, but it wasn't. She was anxious to leave the following morning, but her camping schedule had to keep her out till dark. So seeing that light was so odd that she's unsure how to describe it. She's told that the feral hog problem slowly began to taper off and that they were finding more dead ones in droves. Many of them looked like a large canine had partially eaten them. She's not exactly sure if there's some coincidence between what her coworker and her saw and the nervous, stressed howling of the coyotes at night. She's not here to claim that what she saw was anything specific because she simply doesn't know. She can tell you, though, that she was beyond terrified and that she will testify that it was not a bear or any typical animal. Now, what's really interesting about this story is right before the encounter, the eyewitness describes seeing strange, colorful lights that are commonly attributed to UFOs. For those that don't know, there are many cases from eyewitness stories that detail seeing strange lights in the sky or UFO-like crafts before having an encounter of some kind. This would allude to the fact that there is indeed a connection between the two. The real question here is, what sort of creature or being was right near the cabin that night? And what was its intentions? Crater Lake National Park, while stunning, beautiful, and serene, holds its own dark mysteries and past, while, like many other national parks, is the grounds for many missing persons and strange disappearances, but also a lot of homicides. In the summer of 1979, a David Panabaker decided to take a job here as a seasonal park ranger. But Dave's interest peaked as he was told by fellow rangers and park personnel about a craft that had shown up there shortly after World War II, a Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter that had somehow managed to crash land into this section of the park, but was unable to be retrieved and moved out. So there it laid, just sitting out in the wilderness for anyone to go see, if you knew where to go. Even though nature had mostly reclaimed this area where the plane had crashed, part of the White Star insignia could still be made out from the overgrowth surrounding it, and part of its machine gun was now embedded in the side of the cliff. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to the pilot. Most assumed he had either perished in the crash or had parachuted his way out, and nobody knows what became of him. So, in pursuit of wanting to see this plane, Dave Panabaker decided that taking a day off to go and see this plane wreckage would be really cool. So that's exactly what he did. And as he hiked and ventured off into the wilderness, he eventually lost track of where he was trying to find this plane wreckage. And he searched and he searched and he scoured, but eventually he did not find anything. And after some time, he realized that he was lost, and if he did not stop and get his bearings, he soon would become another statistic of a missing persons in the park. So that's when this young seasonal park ranger sat on a log and began to really think about what he was doing, where he could go, and how he can get himself out of this predicament that he had now found himself in. He still had not found the plane wreckage, and he needed to get out of here now. When he realized, while he was in deep in thought, something was looking at him, something that used to be living, because right in front of him, under a log, was the remains of a deceased World War II Hellcat pilot. Of course, all that remained was just a skeleton at this point, but immediately you can imagine the dread and nervousness and fear that Dave must have felt having his eyes fall upon this old cadaver that is years old at this point. David, probably beyond terrified and also intrigued, actually took the skull and was somehow able to find his way back, because later on, when he had spoke to his chief ranger, who's not at all happy with him, by the way, since he had lost his way and almost became another missing persons, he simply showed his chief ranger the skull, and the chief ranger was astonished when David told his story. They had an entire naval investigation team come out using dental records to identify the person of the skull. The skull had belonged to Ensign Frank Lupo of New Jersey. It is said that Lupo had been part of a squadron of 7 Hellcats flying from Redmond to Red Bluff, California in 1945. All 7 of them had been struggling with visibility in the weather that day, since the clouds were much lower than normal, which had made visibility a lot more difficult. As the squadron flew in the ever-lowering fog of clouds that actually got at one point only around 500 feet above the treetops, all the Hellcats had emerged safely, except for one. They were missing one of their members. Ensign Frank Lupo had somehow probably crashed, or something had happened due to complete lack of visibility, and the rest is history. And this story actually has a positive end, as the Navy was able to return Ensign's skull to Frank's mother. And after 25 years of heartache and heartbreak and lots of questions, she was finally able to have answers and put her son to rest. And just when you think it couldn't get crazier, Dogman and werewolves get involved. Because during his time in prison, Stanley Dean Baker seemed almost active during the full moon. It was said that the apex of the lunar cycle brought out the worst in him, causing him to howl at the moon like a wild animal. This detail is especially chilling considering Yellowstone's long history of Dogman sightings. Did Baker's cult indoctrination involve delusions or the actual attainment of lycanthropy? In one story shared with the channel Darkness Prevails, a couple of nature lovers decided to spend their holiday in Yellowstone National Park. The boyfriend was hoping to use the opportunity to propose to his girlfriend, Lynn. However, whatever lies in Yellowstone had different plans. They began to notice odd things right away. Within minutes of their first hike, they both heard the sound of something immense crashing through the forest. Though nothing was visually observed, as any of us might, they brushed it off as a deer or a moose or a bear, and the couple continued to their campsite. As they're setting up everything, Lynn remarked at how she had spotted a stream nearby and wished to wash her feet. Her old shoes had not done a great job of keeping out the dirt during their hike, and she needed to clean them. The moment they were finished, Lynn rushed to the water's edge, quicker than her boyfriend could even reply. While she made her way to the creek, Lynn's boyfriend set up a camping chair. It was a lovely day, and the hike and the campsite had been a bit tiring, and so he soon began to start dozing off. But his nap, though, was cut short when he heard Lynn begin to scream. Wide awake, He leaps up from his chair and dashes to the creek, shouting her name, but when he arrives, she was still by the stream, one shoe on, the other shoe off. Lynn was visibly disturbed. She told him she had been sitting on the bank when a black, hairy shape had landed in the stream beside her. Whatever it was, bounded out again as quickly as it had entered, disappearing into the woods. Lynn didn't get a great look at it, but she was sure that it was big, bigger than her. It gave her the impression that it was a big dog or even a wolf. And while wolves do indeed inhabit Yellowstone, estimates from 2022 suggest fewer than 100 animals even remain in the park. The odds that Lynn would have seen one of these pack animals alone are rather low. Lynn's boyfriend quickly consoled her, leading her back to the campsite where the couple passed the hours until midday, reading and relaxing. They decided it would be fun to catch their own dinner. Lynn's boyfriend suggested that they grab their fishing gear and head off down the trail to a nearby pond that they knew was nearby. It would only take them about 10 or so minutes to get there on foot. Almost as an afterthought, Lynn's boyfriend realized that the pond might even be a good place to propose, so he tucked the engagement ring in his pocket, and the couple set off along the path, tackle box and fishing rods in hand. As the pond came into view, however, both campers were stopped in their tracks by a growling noise. It sounded like something waiting in the undergrowth on the path ahead. The couple tried to decide on what it was and what they should do. Was it a bear? Was it a wolf? Should they throw a rock? Lynn's boyfriend decided that the wisest course of action was to try and frighten off whatever it was making himself look bigger, waving his arms and shouting. In response, the animal stood up from the tall weeds, revealing a shaggy canine head. It was indeed a wolf. There was no mistaking it as a bear. Lynn had dropped her fishing rod in terror. Neither of them had ever felt the urge of fight or flight before, but they felt the urge to freeze. As they stared on this in disbelief, the head continued its ascent higher than any wolf's would have, until it towered more than 6 feet above the ground, attached to a massive hairy body. It wasn't a wolf, because this thing was standing upright. And slowly, this thing stepped from its place beside the path in an odd sideways motion towards a small tree. One of its arms reached out to steady itself on the trunk, where it stood for a few seconds before noisily stalking off into the forest. When the sound had finally subsided, Lynn asked her boyfriend what they had just seen. He had no idea, despite being an avid outdoorsman. At any rate, the fishing trip was off. The couple wisely decided to return to camp. As they turned around to leave, the sound of footsteps returned, louder and closer, heavier than before. They both dropped everything in their hands and ran as fast as they could, not affording a single moment to look behind them. No longer was the campsite their destination. All they wanted to do was escape. The footsteps continued to pursue the couple as they raced towards safety. And luckily, the sound seemed to stop after they passed their tent. They could only hope that maybe the creature had been distracted by their belongings. Regardless, both Lynn and her boyfriend felt that the safest thing to do was to continue to the car as quickly as they could, an act which took them 45 minutes. They sped away, exhausted, leaving behind all of their camping gear. Despite this loss, it was easily the best decision, and Lynn's boyfriend thanked his lucky stars that he still had the engagement ring in his pocket. Today, the couple is married and expecting their first, but still vividly remember their terrifying encounter with a dogman. A handful of evidence points to the fact that while the few wolves remaining in and around Yellowstone National Park may not be full-fledged dogmen, they certainly exhibit peculiar characteristics. In 2017, park visitor Siddharth Gandhi recorded a chilling interaction on a road passing through Yellowstone's Lamar Valley. The video shows a large black wolf which seems entirely unafraid as it passes in and out of his car's headlights. The absence of a pack, along with the animal's peculiar behavior and large size, have led some viewers to speculate this was not merely a wolf, but something more sinister. A surviving member of an extinct direwolf species, or perhaps even a shapeshifter or werewolf. Almost a full year later and over 150 miles to the north, a rural Montana rancher near Denton shot and killed an odd canine that was harassing his livestock. The creature looked wolf-like, but its proportions seemed all wrong. Its ears were too big, its legs too short, its claws and head too large. While DNA analysis later revealed it to be a gray wolf, anyone who looks at the pictures of the creature can tell it is, at the very least, an aberrant member of its species. The 2018 Denton Wolf actually finds precedent in another strange creature that was shot and killed by settler Israel Hutchins in Montana's Madison Valley in the late 19th century. It reportedly issued unnatural wails every night and was seen snapping a half-inch rope with one bite. Hutchins traded the creature's body for a cow owned by Joseph Sherwood. Unlike the other figures throughout the cryptozoological history, Sherwood had the forethought to preserve and mount the specimen. Sherwood displayed the beast in various stores and small exhibitions through the region under various names. Yet, for over a century, the trophy was somehow lost, and all cryptozoologists could do was marvel over photographs of the creature, which clearly showed a shaggy, thin-limbed creature with a sloping back and a narrow snout. It looked more like a hyena than any North American wolf species. Researchers Lauren Coleman and Jerome Clark speculated that the specimen might represent the Shunkaworakin, a mysterious canine from indigenous legend which reputedly invaded villages at nightfall to steal dogs. Finally, Jack Kirby, Hutchinson's grandson, tracked down the creature down to the Idaho Museum of Natural History in 2008. Modern photography reveals that, although it still appears quite strange, the creature looks much more like a wolf than the earlier pictures indicated. As of 2008, the specimen was on display at the Madison Valley History Museum. The organization seemed resistant to Coleman and Clark's suggestion that they perform a DNA test on the creature, perhaps because they felt mundane results might diminish the exhibit's mystery. Researcher RD6 Killer Clark specializes in the collection of indigenous American stories surrounding what they refer to as star people, the term many tribes use when describing the beings seen in the conjunction with UFOs. Over the course of her investigations, she has recorded dozens of sightings from First Nations people, their testimony straddling the line between modern flying saucer sightings and the myths and legends of their ancestors. One of Clark's informants lived just over the Montana border in Idaho. He was hesitant to share his story, but eventually agreed after he promised to use the pseudonym Bill. Bill said he would only tell his story once, and sometime in the early 2000s, Bill and his cousins Mark, 3 Elk, and Charlie Blue had decided to spend some time hunting elk in the Togwotee Mountains near Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Jackson Hole sits famously between the Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks, and the Togwotee area is only around 30 miles from Yellowstone's border as the crow flies. The plan was to stay in the mountains for a week or until one of them shot an elk, whichever came first. The trio of hunters set off on their horses toward their excursion's destination, an area known as Lyman Ridge. Once there, they separated, agreeing to reconvene before nightfall. Bill was the first to return, and after several more moments, he began to grow concerned regarding his cousin's whereabouts as the sun was rapidly setting. He was just setting off to search for them when he saw a circular, brilliantly lit craft descend from the sky into the valley below. At first, he thought his eyes must be playing tricks on him, but Bill's cousins arrived within moments, and he could tell from the look on their faces that they too had seen it, the UFO. The men decided to walk the ridgeline for a better look, eventually finding where the craft had landed. It wasn't far from them now, perhaps 100 feet, and the hunters shuffled forward on their stomachs to the cliff's edge, where they watched the scene through their rifle scopes for over a half hour. Mark and Charlie suggested they shoot at the vehicle, but Bill insisted this was a bad idea. Who knew what would happen, and furthermore, doing so would only draw unnecessary attention. Bill said that they should instead return to camp, eat dinner, go to bed, and forget about the entire thing. Bill got up to leave, and as he stood, he saw something remarkable. "If I live 1,000 years, I will never forget it," he told Clark. From an opening on the craft, an immense carcass of a bison unceremoniously fell to the ground. All 3 men followed suit, returning to a prone position and readying their rifles. It was almost impossible to keep their scopes steady as their hearts raced and adrenaline coursing through their systems. Bill, Mark, and Charlie watched and waited, fingers on their triggers, ready to defend themselves. Nothing further happened. At last, the lights on the ship began to rotate and the craft jetted into the sky, leaving the hunters cloaked in darkness. They simply stood up, returned to camp, and went to sleep without discussing anything. While this may seem illogical, Similar behavior is reported consistently across UFO witnesses, who often find themselves acting strangely after their encounters. It wasn't until morning that the conversation turned to the spaceship and the bison. Bill was now eager to discuss what they had seen, and it took everything within his power not to rouse his cousins or go off and investigate the landing site on his own. Instead, Bill waited patiently for Mark and Charlie to wake up, using this time to fry up some bacon in a skillet. Once his cousins awoke, he shared his plan for the morning and suggested that they investigate the valley where the UFO had landed. After breakfast, they searched the area, and it wasn't long before they had stumbled upon the carcass. They were, as Bills later put it, shocked beyond words. The bison was a pregnant female and had been horrendously mutilated. Empty eye sockets stared back at the hunters. The mother bison had neither its ears nor its tail. Her stomach had been carved, revealing the calf inside, whose eyes and genitals were also missing as well. The placenta could not be found. Had this poor creature been abducted from Yellowstone National Park? Estimates of the park's bison population sit between 2,300 to 5,500 individuals. It seemed a likely explanation. The hunters fought off the urge to report the incident to the game warden. No one would believe their fantastic story, meaning blame would inevitably fall upon them, along with time behind bars and a hefty fine. This, in addition to how disturbing the sight had been, was the reason behind Bill's secrecy. He concluded his story to Clark with a few chilling thoughts, saying this: "The old-timers used to talk about the star people. Sometimes they came to the sweat lodges of our elders, traveling the stars and visiting these star people. When they returned, they told us wondrous tales of our ancestors. As a boy, I never understood it. As a man, I grew up to believe that it was true. I was in the sweat lodge when miraculous things would happen because of the star people. And now, when I close my eyes and I see the carcass of the mother buffalo and her calf, I know they are not the helpers, the ancestors. These are a different group of star people, and maybe we really should be worried about them." And while ships and people have been known to vanish around the Lake Michigan Triangle, that's not all. There have been mysterious planes that have just vanished without a trace, just like Northwest Flight 2501. Because in 1950, Northwest Airlines Flight 2501, carrying 58 people, had crashed into Lake Michigan. And unfortunately for all these people, they didn't just crash into the lake. They crashed into the Lake Michigan Triangle. At this time in history, in the 50s, it was the deadliest airline accident in all of American history, and the plane and its wreckage were never found or any trace of the survivors. The last known information given from this flight was that the pilot had requested to fly down to 2,500 feet due to a severe electrical storm that was lashing out on the lake with high velocity winds. Very strange, don't you think? And that's when the plane disappeared from radar. Is it possible, as some have theorized, that the plane entered a portal and it disappeared? Because to this day, the wreckage was never found, and it is only speculated that the plane had to have crashed into the lake. But then, how come there's no pieces of wreckage? How come there's no plane body to find on the bottom of the lake? And how come there were no bodies of the 58 on the plane that had washed ashore or had been found floating in the water? It's as if they simply had flown right into another dimension, only to vanish forever. And to this very day in 2022, the crash and the cause of it still remain completely unknown. There is one interesting detail regarding Flight 2501, is that about 2 or so hours after the plane was reported missing, there were several police officers corroborating their details that they had all saw this strange, mysterious red light just sitting there hovering over above the lake. And it sat there perfectly still for around 10 minutes before just instantly vanishing. This led many to believe that a UFO or some sort of interdimensional force was responsible for the disappearance of not only the plane, but the many others that have gone missing in the Lake Michigan Triangle. Now, you might be sitting there scratching your head thinking, okay, there has to be some rational explanation to all of these strange disappearances and phenomena, right? Well, many have also theorized that the reason this Lake Michigan Triangle exists is because of an underwater Stonehenge. Yeah, you heard me right. Lake Michigan actually has an underwater Stonehenge that is quite popular for divers and scuba enthusiasts to go check out. Discovered in 2007 by Northwestern Michigan College professor Mark Hawley, he was scuba diving, mapping shipwrecks when him and his diving team had come across this strange rock formation only about 40 feet below the water's surface. And he referred to it as the Stonehenge of Michigan because its features are very similar to that of the one found in England, except there is one boulder that appears to have ancient carvings or writings on it, which could mean a lot of things. And while many people claim to visit and explore this same Stonehenge, the exact mapped location has not been revealed. Although I'm sure if you looked hard enough, you could probably find GPS coordinates, as there are divers that do go down there and check it out. So when you look at the puzzle pieces like this, you can almost wonder, is there a bigger picture here at play? Was there somehow an ancient civilization long before Lake Michigan that practiced rituals or magic or something to change the magneticism of this given area? Or is this just a natural anomaly on the Earth's surface? However, the strangeness of all this doesn't just stop there with those disappearances and sightings. There have been other bizarre phenomena that have also been happening around and in this area. Another great example is mysterious ice blocks supposedly falling out of the sky, along with people reporting seeing balls of fire and strange, bizarre hovering formations of lights from UFOs to strange aircraft they don't recognize. Sure, this could be explained away by the strange weather happening around the lake or particularly unidentified government craft, but when you add all the pieces together, surely there's something else going on here. I don't know if this exactly has anything to do with the Lake Michigan Triangle, but it is interesting that the Manistee National Forest, which is right next to the triangle, is also a hotbed of the cryptid Dogman, with various encounters and reports of people seeing a supposed canine bipedal creature in the same national forest. Of course, they are supposedly spotted all over the state of Michigan, Wisconsin, and generally the Midwest, but the Manistee Forest happens to be a hotspot. Is there somehow a correlation here between that and maybe the supernatural pull that this triangle has? Because even with that pushed aside, this whole Lake Michigan Triangle seems to be a hotbed or a magnet for UFOs and other strange activity going on in and around the lake. Is it possible that at one point, long ago, there was something here drawing this attention and energy to it? Or is this just a series and a string of bizarre circumstances that can easily be explained away? I'm merely just asking questions. You guys can answer that. Going back to the Stonehenge for just a moment, Dr. Mark Hawley had stated that this Stonehenge, this underwater rock formation, could have potentially served as a prehistoric herding line for caribou, which is very similar in nature to another underwater formation in Lake Huron. However, according to the Chicago Tribune, which they had interviewed several native tribes members from all around the Midwest, they believe, or at least speculate, that these stones underground could have been an ancient ceremonial site, which, as you know from all the videos I do, that usually when you get to a burial site or anything in relation to Native American ceremonial sites, there always appears to be strange phenomena involving the paranormal or supernatural. This is just an observation and a theory. However, it is very possible that storms and high winds could have caused these ships to be damaged and flooded, therefore sinking and the wreckage just dispersing and never being found, or sweeping bodies away to be buried forever and eaten by whatever lives in the water. Even the underwater Stonehenge could have a couple of reasonable theories, but what do you guys think? Is the entirety of the Lake Michigan Triangle simply just made up of hoaxes and stories that have been blown out of proportion and that are very rationally explainable? Or is there truly something supernatural at work here, an ancient force that has been here for much longer than we could ever comprehend? Jeremy Foyer had worked as a park ranger in the Mount Rainier National Park in and around 2014. He had lived within the confines of the park, but primarily would stay at the Sunrise Visitor Center on the weekends. During the time of this account, it was around 3:30 in the morning, and Jeremy was driving up kind of a more rockier, mountainous road in very dense fog, and his headlights were able to cut through just enough to where he could see where he was going. Now this night, there was very little moonlight and much to see around him, so he's going slow, he's clutching the wheel, trying his best to just navigate his way through this road. And like most other accounts, he sees something that terrifies him. As he's coming around a bend in the mountain road, he catches movement off to his right. And at first he thinks it's a person because it wasn't an animal like how it would be when crouched down on all fours, but more standing up. And as he starts to slow down, he's doing probably roughly about 20-25 miles an hour. He sees this figure stop and get right about to the edge of the road, and he's coming around this bend at the same time. So just out of the dim lighting, he could see a figure, but as his headlights round the bend and begin to shine and partially illuminate this figure, he immediately notices that this was not a person at all, but rather an animal or creature of some sort. and a bipedal one at that. Now, his description of this creature that he saw was that it was no taller than a man, probably roughly maybe around 5'8 to 5'11, because he's about 5'10 himself and said that it was about his same height. But he said it looked just like a person, just very hairy, and that the head was distinctly that of a German shepherd or similar to a timber wolf. And that as soon as it came to the edge of the road, it stopped, turned its head, and looked directly into his eyes. And immediately, he comes to a complete stop. His mouth is wide open, and he's staring at this thing in complete disbelief, with his brain now trying to process. And judging by its appearance, he could immediately tell this was not some person coming down the mountainside in a werewolf costume. This looked far too real, and he could see the muscles rippling underneath its chest and body. And speaking of which, the fur and skin right around the chest and the biceps were very thin, meaning that you could see muscle definition. You could see its chest contract and expand as it took its breath, even seeing the hot breath in the cold night air, and its eyes glowing this amberish yellow color looking right at him. And as he's staring at this thing, his eyes kind of slowly begin to go down, and he notices at its sides were human hands, or at least human-like hands, where it had 4 fingers and an opposable. They just had long 3 to 4 inch claws at the end of them, but he said if there was ever a living werewolf that this was it, even though he understands the ridiculous notion claiming that this creature looked similar to a fictitious animal, but that's what it was. Or so he's convinced it was some kind of animal that resembles that. And almost seeming to break his gaze, this thing begins to step forward into his headlights, coming directly at his vehicle. Now, as this is happening, he's still locked in shock, mouth open, and Jeremy also looks and notices that, unlike a dog which has hocks, this thing has legs just like a man, knees bent a very specific way with ankles and large feet. And this thing is just casually strolling through right to his vehicle. At this point, Jeremy doesn't know what to do. Not only is he confused, but now he's incredibly frightened, and immediately he goes to look down and put the car in reverse. And as he goes to do that, he feels something hit the car. And immediately he looks up and sees that this thing has now cleared the short distance in a matter of only seconds and is now putting its hand on the hood of the car, pressing it down while never ever breaking its gaze into Jeremy's eyes. The way Jeremy interprets this is that it was threatening him, or at least trying to be the alpha one, the dominant one, letting Jeremy know, you're in my territory, you better respect it. And as Jeremy took his foot off the brake pedal and slowly on the gas, his car began to drift down. And as he began going in reverse slowly, but also trying to speed up to get away from this thing, it just stood there as its headlights began to pull further and further back, with this thing just being completely still before eventually losing all sight of it in the fog as he drove in reverse away. Jeremy at this point begins crying and breaking down because he's terrified, unsure of how to prevail against such a bizarre and terrifying creature. So he's able to regain himself after a couple of moments, realizing that this thing could still be coming toward his vehicle in the fog. And so he decides that he has no other way. He can't just reverse all the way back down this road. He has to put his car in drive and drive a little faster, hoping he won't encounter this thing in which he last saw it standing in the middle of the road right in his way. So he puts the car in drive, braces, and wishes for the best. And he goes a little bit faster this time, and within a couple of 100 yards, he gets to the exact same spot that he had seen this wolf creature at, but it's nowhere to be found. And so he's not even bothering to look around or check his surroundings. He just wants to get off this dirt road so he can go home. Fortunately, Jeremy makes it past without any incident, but as he is now past this point, breathing a sigh of relief that it is over, he notices something in his rearview mirror. So he's driving, now hoping he could see the fog clearing up a bit, so he's hoping he can get down to the road. He sees this thing coming out of the fog, running towards his vehicle, but now on all fours. Jeremy, incredibly frightened by what he's now seeing in his rearview mirror, decides to speed up even more, and after a little ways, he's able to get through the fog as it kind of clears up as he's descending in elevation. This chase only lasted for about 45 or so seconds, never fully catching up to his vehicle, but getting very close. And just like that, along with the fog, this thing disappears. And now that he's low enough in elevation, he doesn't see it anymore. Jeremy was fortunate to be able to make it home safely without any other incident or anything following him or any other sightings. Jeremy would move at the end of 2014 to Pennsylvania, where he continued his career as a park ranger in the Forest Service. And since that night, Jeremy Foyer has not had any other encounters like this. In the spring of 2014, A man by the name of Lee had decided to make a solo camping trip in the Keystone State Park in Oklahoma. This is where they had an experience they can't quite grasp. They've been an avid outdoorsman for as long as they can remember, so it's not exactly an unfamiliar setting, but this episode still left him with his skin crawling, even to the next day. Now, he had been hiking roughly for about an hour and a half, maybe 2. He kept losing track of time because it was so incredibly beautiful. The trees were thick, but the trail cut through them, so you could see many open skies and the sunlight shining down on everything. It was also very quiet, which is something he loves about the outdoors. There were no cars or planes or anything like that to ruin the sound pollution experience. As he hiked along, his mind began wandering as often as it does when you're alone, and then suddenly, this feeling hit him like a ton of bricks. It felt like somebody just punched him right in the gut, and all the hair stood up on end and every muscle began to tense all at once. Instinctively, he stopped dead in his tracks and looked around trying to figure out what happened, but nothing seemed amiss except for one thing. This overwhelming sense of dread came over him from nowhere, like some evil malicious presence had entered the world without any warning whatsoever. And as soon as these feelings overcame him, which seemed to last for minutes, they immediately would subside, leaving behind this eerie silence throughout the forest, as if everything and everyone had just transpired. After these initial feelings had passed, nothing else really happened until later, after dark, when things began to get downright weird. Already, he felt like he was being watched. Now, before going into detail about what occurred during the dark, here are some other details worth mentioning. The weather conditions were perfect and sunny and warm, so not much wind blowing at all, and visibility was excellent since there wasn't any fog. No mosquitoes, and there were wildlife sightings including deer and droppings throughout the entire hike, which means that this was a very active area. Lots of animal noises too, so that means there wasn't an alpha predator in the area, hopefully. So now, fast forward to the night, and Lee is lying in his sleeping bag listening to the sounds of nature around him, and he hears many things, but nothing out of the ordinary until later. All at once, he began hearing this very loud crashing sound coming from somewhere in the distance. It began to sound like a tree had fallen and was being broken up by something. This noise continued for about 5 or so minutes before abruptly stopping without any other sounds afterward, except for the call of distant coyotes howling off in another direction. The thing that got his attention, though, is that after those noises had ceased, everything went completely silent. No animals were making noise, no crickets, nothing. No wind even blew through the tent to sway things back and forth. Everything was deathly quiet. And even though there should have at least been some night ambient noises, it wasn't. Nothing moved anywhere near him either during this period, and everything began to feel so eerie, especially when you're camping alone like he was. So whatever caused that commotion simply didn't want anything to do with anyone. Whether it was a Bigfoot or not is irrelevant because Lee and it both knew that each other were there and based on his previous experiences was just trying to respect its space. Lee was trying his best not to get caught off guard in hopes that something wouldn't happen because Lee was convinced that whatever was out there had actually uprooted and ripped out a tree and was breaking it up, or so that's how he described it. Is it possible that what Lee encountered out there, or at least heard, was potentially a Bigfoot? And while Lee didn't actually see anything, hearing those sounds can be quite frightening. And then, of course, you have all the noises just completely ceasing, which is terrifying in and of itself. And after reading countless Bigfoot stories, this one almost reminds me of the Bigfoot who's trying to let everyone know that this is his territory and to try and spook people off of it. Just a theory, of course, but the details are consistent with stories that are similar to that area and all. So what do you think he experienced? This fourth story comes from a guy who calls himself Frederick. And he's writing this report because of a recent encounter with what appeared to be some kind of winged human-like creature. This occurred at the Fort Supply Lake National Recreational Area, which is located in Oklahoma. This happened on June 14th, 2019 at around 11 p.m. He was camping with his girlfriend and her family at the time, and they're staying in a large group of campsites that are on the south side of the lake and very close to a large highway. Now, according to Frederick, this area in particular has been known for many Bigfoot sightings over several decades now, at least according to his family. And so he's sitting around the campfire with his girlfriend and her family, and they heard what sounded like something big moving in the sky about roughly a couple hundred yards away. although because it was dark, they couldn't really see anything, and they did not have any flashlights strong enough to shine up into the sky to see what it could have been, but he said he'd heard the sounds of large wings flapping. But when he tried to look around, couldn't find anything. So he kind of just blew it off and just thought it was strange. After not thinking much more about it, he began to hear these loud grunting noises, but again tried his best to just ignore it and just think it was strange. Now, fast forward almost 2 hours later, when everybody had now trotted off to bed, himself included. His girlfriend's dad had actually stayed up himself drinking beer and watching TV inside the camper trailer parked right next to the tent. Frederick, feeling a little cold, wanted to get up and go sit by the fire, which was still going, by the way. And so as he gets up out of his bed and out of his tent, he realizes now is the perfect time to relieve himself. So he walks over to the grassy area between both trailers where there is a lot of tall pine trees surrounding them. And he steps outside and begins taking care of business behind one of the trees, then heads back over towards the tent about 20 feet away. This is right when he's able to see this huge black creature almost appearing directly above him. Now, you might stop and say, well, wait a minute. It was dark outside at night. How did this happen? Well, Frederick did mention that there was moonlight out. Although how much, I'm not sure. He didn't exactly say, but there was at least some sort of illumination, as he had saw this outline of this large, half-man, half-bat is how he described it, levitating right there in the sky above him. His description of this creature is that it had leathery wings that were at least 10 feet long and also appeared to have 2 human-like legs. It apparently circled above him for about 30 seconds before darting off towards the direction of the lake. He even watched it fly over the water until he lost sight of it. And then darkness. This is when a second one appeared from the forest, and this one looked much larger than the first. Frederick was completely beside himself, terrified, running back inside the tent to wake up his girlfriend, but she did not wake up. After several minutes of trying to get his girlfriend awake to tell her what had happened, she did not believe him. So he goes and runs outside, and of course could not find them anywhere. Now, this is a story he hasn't shared with many people, but he decided to with me, so again, I kind of take it with a grain of salt. It is very interesting, at least, and the flying humanoid phenomena is a very strange one. While there isn't as many creature stories like that, like there are with Bigfoot and Dogman, they are still out there, and there does seem to be a heavy concentration of Mothman and flying creature beings being spotted in the Midwest and East Coast specifically. I have no idea if there truly is a connection there or what the reasoning is for that. However, I will say that it's at least interesting. Our final story today is by a man who calls himself Roger. He had been a park ranger for the U.S. Forest Service in the early 1980s and had an incident that occurred one night while driving to a state park on his way home in Oklahoma. The incident occurred midsummer of 1980 on an asphalt road that cuts through some hills. He had been driving his patrol truck for about 45 minutes after leaving work at the end of a shift. The park was pitch black other than his headlights and the high half moon overhead, and he describes feeling pretty alone as usual. He always drove fast because it just felt like something would jump out and scare him if he didn't keep up to speed with what seemed to be endless curves around sudden drops. So finally, he kind of kept speeding along until he came upon a small clearing barely 50 feet across where 2 dirt paths kind of meet right at angles, and there was a large sycamore tree standing watch over both roads leading away. It was also dimly outlined by the moon. And as soon as his headlights passed directly over this spot, they illuminated 2 very large silhouettes standing between himself and either road. And directly behind these beasts stood another smaller, but not quite full grown, but still substantial version which appeared more like a yearling cub compared to his parent's stature. Both beasts were huge, however almost twice his height, each shoulder wide and 8 feet tall, perhaps weighing 700 pounds if not more. Both bore coal black fur covering their bodies except facial areas, revealing eyes glowing orange, with what he described as cones of yellow light emanating downward. A strong odor had emanated outward to carrying traces of decomposing meat mixed with raw sewage. He had sat there frozen behind the wheel of his truck with hands locked tightly around the steering wheel, until one of these things slowly began raising its arm, holding onto a tree trunk, and then in some sort of communicative way began knocking a few times against the tree trunk, as if letting him know that these creatures were acknowledging him in some sort of rudimentary form of communication between these two sentient creatures. While trying to grasp and understand what was going on, he quickly concluded that he needed to get out of here. So he smashed his foot down on the accelerator and tore down the road at high speed. But when he turned around to look back again, they were gone. Neither was in sight or even heard while driving off into the darkness. He still can't believe what had happened to him, but keeps it to himself until years later. Now, there are many versions of Dogman or Bigfoot type creatures that are well known, such as the Ohio Grassman, the Michigan Dogman, the Arkansas Sasquatch, and of course many others, but this incident happened at night in northeastern Oklahoma. This doesn't exactly sound like your typical North American Bigfoot or Sasquatch encounter, but no doubt it was potentially Dogman. The smaller one perhaps a youngling, and the larger ones a father and mother. So did he truly see two large upright canine creatures this night, or was this simply a case of him being exhausted or a possible misidentification? Perhaps people in werewolf costumes maybe? I'll let you be the judge. Matthew Bunker, a 28-year-old mountaineer hailing from Seattle, had unfortunately perished on Mount Rainier, falling into a crevasse. Matthew Bunker's story, while very fascinating and interesting, is also a tragic one, and a true reminder that even with all the mysterious disappearances and things going on within Mount Rainier, you can never be too safe because anything can happen to anyone no matter how inexperienced or experienced. Since an early age, Matthew's father, Joe Bunker, was a veteran and commercial pilot, and it's probably by no surprise that Matthew wanted to continue somewhat in his father's footsteps, becoming an avid outdoorsman, a lover of hiking and mountaineering, and also, like his father, serving in the military. After 5 years of service in the military, he left because he wanted to pursue being an avid explorer of the outdoors. The man went trail running, mountain biking, he scaled mountains all throughout the Pacific Northwest. This man was unstoppable, and unfortunately, Matthew Bunker did his very last hike on Friday, June 26th, right as he was descending Thumb Rock on Mount Rainier's Liberty Ridge route. And while he had been missing, unfortunately, they found Bunker's body in a crevasse on June 29th, only 3 days after he had been reported missing. Elaine Ledreau, a park ranger who served at Mount Rainier National Park from 2005 to 2010, experienced some very eerie things to have happen to her one day on a patrol down the Paul Peak Trail. It was a beautiful spring morning in late May. There were no other hikers or people on that segment of trail that she was on this morning. It was roughly about 10 a.m. The Pacific Northwest sky broke away from early morning overcast to beautiful sunshine. The birds were chirping. She described everything being as perfect as it could be for this morning. As she's making her way down this trail, her nostrils become assaulted by this foul odor. And as she starts to recognize this odor as not just a stink, but that of death or a carcass, which, by the way, when you're in the wilderness, it's not uncommon for deer and other animals to die or to be feeding on carcasses. So she kind of just, at first, she just brushed it off, thinking that she's sure there's a reasonable explanation for this odor, but it was so strong and pungent, like it was within 10 feet of her. I mean, she could smell it. And that's when she realized, after something had caught her attention up by a tree nearby, that there was a doe, probably about 30 or so, 5 feet estimated, up on a tree. Now this doe was actually slumped over this large branch, and it was literally as if something had grabbed it and ripped it open, with its entrails hanging all out and down the tree, as if it had been splattered. Elaine described the scene before her horrifying and gory, and she described that whatever had killed this doe, it looked like it had grabbed its back two legs and smacked it really hard up against a tree with so much force that its innards had splattered up against and actually dripped all the way down the tree and then continued to hang the rest of its body up on the tree branch. Immediately disturbed, disgusted, and startled by this newfound discovery, she then sensed danger. As she's holding her nose, observing what's right in front of her on this tree, she notices all the sounds around her. The beautiful morning birds chirping, the soft wind, came to silence. And instantly, the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, and her skin begins to prickle. Because now that she knows this was not the kill of a bear or a mountain lion, and even more disturbing is that this kill is very fresh, probably no older than an hour or two at most. And that's when Elaine reports the feeling of being watched and observed like a mouse in a maze. And this bad feeling came over her, like she needed to leave now. Her entire body was screaming, "Get out." She didn't know how to describe the emotions and feelings that were coming into her body, but she just knew that she had to get back up the trail and get out of here now. Now, as she turns to go back up the trail, instantly, she begins noticing movement off in the tree line, probably about 20 or so yards away from her. Now, whatever it was, which she initially thought it was a person, but the more it began paralleling her in the tree line, she could hear just how heavy it was, but also noted that whatever or whoever it was not only extremely heavy, but they were trying to be sneaky and discreet, which made her even more nervous and frightened. So now Elaine's quickly picking up the pace, trying her best to get back to the main portion of the trail that Paul Peaks connects to. After making it back to the main ranger station, completely full of fright and fear, she confided in her supervisor about her fears and what she had experienced when he had just blankly looked at her and told her, "Yeah, we've been having a bit of a bear issue lately, just be careful." Completely ignoring anything else of her story that she had to add, and he would not hear anything more of it. Elaine thought his response was very out of character, very mono-expressive, and very strange because she was somewhat close to her supervisor. This was a guy who was very level-headed, very intellectual, very analytical of situations, and for him to give her a generic response like this, it made it seem like he was either trying to write it off or just push it down and ignore it, or perhaps he knew more about this kind of stuff and that this was not the first time that this was seen, spotted, or had occurred within the confines of the park. It's stories like Elaine's that really make you wonder what happened and why. But more importantly, I would love to know what you guys think in the comments below, so be sure to go ahead and do that. And don't forget to smack that like button. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and smack that subscribe button and keep your notifications turned on because I release great new storytelling videos on the mysterious and supernatural. As always, guys, I love y'all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the next video.